Hi, my name is Graham Harwood, and welcome to the Forum Podcast, a University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy podcast where students can come on and give their views on policy and do interviews with policy experts. Today we have an interview for you as a collaboration with the Center for Effective Government at the University of Chicago. We are talking to Rudy Mehrbani of the Democracy Fund, discussing personnel as policy and the subtleties of staffing the federal government to ensure efficacy, expertise, and most importantly, ethics. As you will hear, Rudy is an enthusiastic advocate for the effective government. I know I learned a lot about the distinctions between different government hiring offices, and I hope you will too. I have the pleasure to welcome Rudy Mehrbani, Senior Director for the Governance Program at the Democracy Fund, an independent foundation working to ensure our political system can withstand emerging challenges and serve the American people. Rudy focuses on government accountability, upholding the rule of law, and safeguarding our system of checks and balances. Previously, he served as a senior fellow and counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice, as a board member on the William J. Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board, and the director of the Presidential Personnel Office during the Obama administration, as well as serving on the Obama administration transition team, White House counsel's office, and as a special assistant to the president. Rudy earned his BA from Emory University and a JD from the University of Virginia Law School, as well as a degree in International Comparative Business Law at Bucerius Law School in Hamburg, Germany. Rudy is also currently serving as a CEG Senior Practitioner Fellow for the 2022-2023 school year. Thank you very much, Rudy.
Hey, Graham. Thanks for having me.
So, the Center for Effective Government has you as a fellow this year, I suppose. Let's start with that. What does effective government mean to you? And can you define what it means for the government to be effective in 2023?
Sure. At a very base level, I think that an effective government is one that can deliver for the American people. More than that, for me, when I work on issues to make government more effective, what we are trying to do is make it more transparent, more responsive to the needs of Americans, and more accountable to Americans. People should have a sense of what government is doing to improve their lives. Government should be able to adapt as the needs change, whether that means responding to a pandemic or to climate change or to increases in crime, or improving the way our criminal justice system functions. And when government is abused, either by political or other actors, government should have the capacity to respond to that abuse and to hold itself and individual actors accountable.
So that's a pretty wide definition. It seems like the biggest things you're focusing on kind of that transparency and responsiveness aspect of it. So one of the things whenever somebody kind of brings up transparency, I think there are a lot of reports that our government gives out every day. You know, I can go on and Google Congressional Research Service or any of those reports. To what extent do you think that those reports need to be published in an accessible way? And the average person has a job, they've got a family, they've got, everything else they might be interested in. What is the best way that we can kind of take something just like the government publishing another report to making it accessible and actually like something that the average citizen can respond to, even though they have all the other, demands on their time?
Yeah, so this is a big issue and it's a big problem. The context will differ depending on what you're talking about. I mean, let's take one example. I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about personnel policy and personnel issues within government. So I'll use that as an example where government recently has made some progress on this front. So historically, the federal government, as an example, would not, on a regular basis anyway, publish the positions and the occupants of different positions on a regular basis. So say you were trying to contact the head of a given office, or you wanted to just contact that person's office generally. Like, it would be hard to know where to go. So this past Congress, during the lame duck, there was a piece of legislation called the Plum Act that was passed, which requires federal agencies to list the folks who occupy specific senior political positions, and to update that list and to make it accessible online through agency websites. So that's an example of making that personnel system more transparent and allowing citizens an avenue for gaining information and being able to identify who they should contact over particular issues. But there's other ways to do this. So, when President Obama was implementing the stimulus bill from 2009, so there was a new innovation where the government created a website so people could see how those Stimulus Act dollars were being spent. And that's another example, one that has been continued in various ways to this day. Folks can see where the federal government's dollars are going and how it's being spent. And that could provide some foundation for different policy disputes.
I mean, we saw some of that with the recent reports that have come out about the COVID spending and some of the loan forgiveness programs. Do you think that's kind of the sunlight remedy?
So some of that is happening. The COVID stimulus funds, because of the emergency nature of how some of those funds were distributed, my understanding, and I'm not an expert in this, is that a lot of that they weren't able to in real time report where all of those funds were going. And some of the audits that have been done now on the back end show that there was some fraud in how those stimulus funds were distributed. Now, that is not an indictment necessarily of all programs of that type. And overall, my understanding is that most folks who have dived into the numbers would say that it was still a success, but there are improvements that can be made in how those stimulus funds are distributed. So there are some allegations around folks receiving funding because they had specific relationships with members or connections with members of Trump's administration, or that dollars were inequitably distributed. Small businesses, minority-owned businesses were not given access to the same amount of funding as others, those are big problems that we need to look at. The more sunlight that could be shined on that kind of spending, I think the better.
So you really wanted to talk about your background in government is mostly around the personnel policy, particularly when you were at the White House. Can you describe what the Office of Personnel Management does for our listeners? It's one of those words I think we hear it about once every 6 months in the news, and it seems pretty important. So would you mind just giving a background on that?
Sure. So I think you mean the Office of Presidential Personnel, right?
Thank you. Excuse me.
Yeah, no, it's all right. It's easily confused with the Office of Personnel Management. So the Office of Personnel Management is the executive branch agency that is most responsible for implementing, I think, personnel policy as it applies to the civil servants throughout the government, and in implementing the Civil Service Reform Act and all of the due process, procedural, and merit-based requirements and regulations connected to hiring. The Presidential Personnel Office is an office within the White House that is primarily responsible with the recruiting, the appointment, the retaining, and professional development of political appointees. So of the over 2 million federal employees that work within the federal government around the country, most of which are not based in D.C., only a tiny sliver of those are political appointees. There's about 5,000 political appointees in total. 1,200 or so are the most senior political appointees that require Senate confirmation. So the president's cabinet are the ones that most immediately come to mind. But there are a lot of sub-cabinet appointees. So the assistant secretaries, the deputy assistant secretaries in some places, but mostly the deputy secretaries, rather. Interestingly, I would not say that my most significant experience has been in personnel. So I'm a lawyer, as you know, by background, and I think it was through my legal work in the White House counsel's office that I came to be asked to do the job as director of presidential personnel. Is the most senior role that I had in the Obama administration. And it was a great pleasure to do that job. I will say that my old boss, Dennis McDonough, who was the chief of staff at the time, he used to introduce me to people and say that I had the worst job in the White House, because for every one political appointment we have and every one person we get to fill, we were able to fill with a political appointment, there were countless others who were unable to do that job. And I was the one who was primarily responsible for telling those folks, particularly at the senior level, that they were not going to get that job. And that's a very tough thing to do, and to balance all of the competing interests that come into play when you're trying to fill a particular position is challenging. Interestingly, the Presidential Personnel Office in the White House is not responsible for the employees who work in the White House. So we were responsible for all of the appointments that happen throughout the executive branch and the agencies, but not those who were appointed to White House positions.
That feels like a very tough position to be in, to always probably spending more time saying no than anything else. Between the first the Obama administration, then the Trump administration, now the Biden administration, there's definitely been kind of a change in both the profile and the general tenor and understanding of who is working in the White House. Particularly after the high-profile controversies of the Trump administration, the idea of personnel as policy has kind of slipped a little bit into the lexicon, and definitely for policy nerds, it very much has. Can you talk about how you think of that in the executive branch personnel, both from the appointment standpoint, and we're going to get into this more later, but the political appointee versus civil servant, and how you differentiate between the two?
Yeah, so personnel as policy was literally our mantra in the Presidential Personnel Office. I don't tweet very much these days anymore, but if you were to look at my Twitter account, you will see repeated references to personnel as policy. A lot of the controversies that arose during the Trump administration, I think, demonstrates the weaknesses of the political appointments process. If you have a president and an administration that is not dedicated to appointing the most professional and ethical folks to serve in certain positions. So President Obama, he wanted to have the most skilled and diverse set of appointees in history. Okay, now that's a very lofty goal, but it's a worthy goal. And it is what dictated how we identified, recruited, and appointed people to positions. So we wanted the best of the best. We wanted people who would serve honorably and ethically and would do their job on behalf of the American people, and that weren't beholden to other personal or financial interests. That is what we thought about in hiring political appointees. Now, the reason why you have political appointees in certain positions is because those are the folks that are on the president's team who are trying to implement the president's agenda. Now, they're directing agencies and agency policies, but the agencies themselves and certain offices within those agencies have their own missions. And the folks who know the substance of how to implement particular regulations, or who are doing research on the different effects that policies might have when it comes to climate or even the economy or how our ecosystem functions. Most of the jobs, as I said, are filled with career civil servants. So they are not susceptible to turnover when it comes to changes in administration. For those jobs, you want people who satisfy all of the merit-based qualifications for those jobs, and you want them focused on overarching missions, and you want their expertise to inform the policymaking that the political appointees might be trying to advance, and to ensure that when policy is being made, that all of the requisite things are being considered and that it's being implemented in a legal, ethical, responsible way that will have the most positive impact for the American people. So I'm making that distinction, because I think it's important to understand the limits of where I think the domain of the Presidential Personnel Office begins and ends. And I suspect you were going to get into a conversation about how some of the abuses that you referenced that took place during the Trump administration blurred that line and created some risks and dangers that essentially led to some spillover into the civil service appointments.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to get into that. First, I'd like to ask, if you don't mind, about more. So I read an editorial written a couple of years ago about the kind of the judicial appointment process.
Sure.
And particularly, there's those typically require Senate confirmation. And could you, in particular, talk about Justice Kavanaugh's nomination and confirmation process? And now that we're several years on, can you talk about what we've learned about, there was that process. Now Justice Coney Barrett and Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson have all had their own nomination processes, each with their own controversies and different variations on Senate questioning, if that's a reasonable way of putting it. Could you both give our listeners some insight into the vetting process and as well as what the future of judicial accountability as well as there a better way we can do the Senate can perform its advising consent function?
Yeah, sure. So I think that what you're referencing are a few articles that I wrote about the background investigation process that nominees are subject to when they go through the nomination and confirmation process. So what motivated me to do to write those pieces and to weigh in was a statement that Senator Grassley, I think, and other Republicans were making about their limited ability and role to get more information about the circumstances and the allegations against Justice Kavanaugh, and that the FBI was limited in what they were able to investigate and what information they were able to share with the White House. And when you go through the nomination process, the White House requests a background investigation on its candidates by the FBI. So in most cases, in an ordinary White House, that background investigation would be done prior to the formal nomination of a candidate. And the White House would then receive either a summary report or a full report on that investigation. If there are gaps in that investigation, or if there are questions raised, it is up to the White House to then go back to the FBI to ask for more information, or what is called a supplemental investigation. So when I was in the White House counsel's office and I was the person who was liaising between the White House and the FBI, it was not infrequent that we would have to go back to the FBI to request a supplemental investigation on a particular matter. To hear during Justice Kavanaugh's process that the senators misrepresent the White House's ability to get more information was really frustrating to me. And so I felt compelled to explain to the public that they were essentially lying, that they weren't being forthright with what the FBI could do. The other thing I wrote about was how there is a significant problem and power imbalance when it comes to the background investigation process. So the way the process is set up, the FBI performs its function at the request of the White House. So the White House is essentially its client when it's conducting the background investigation process. And there's also pressures on the FBI to conduct its investigation without the public and the media finding out that it's conducting its investigation, because, as you know, in Washington, there's a significant interest in making sure that the potential nominees for certain positions are not leaked in advance of the president's announcement. So they've got to do it quietly. And then they also have to do it rapidly because, in the ordinary course, I think on average, an investigation that looks at the past 15 years of a nominee's life took, on average, 6 to 8 weeks for the FBI to do. And sometimes there is not that much time. there is the ability for the FBI to dedicate more resources to a background investigation so they can complete it faster. And, we often had to request the FBI to dedicate more resources to a background investigation so we could do it faster. And there's a lot of different reasons why you might need to do that. But those pressures on the FBI sometimes limit the breadth and scope of its investigation. So it's incumbent on the White House and the attorneys there to then go back to the FBI to request more information should they deem it necessary. And so one of the things that I tried to highlight in some of the pieces that I wrote was the need for the Senate to try to assess and use their own independent authority based on their advice and consent responsibility, a constitutional responsibility, to request more information from the FBI or dedicate more resources to researching candidates' backgrounds. Unfortunately, that process, as far as I understand, has not changed.
It really feels like advice and consent might have used some more clarification.
The advice and consent is pretty broad responsibility, right? So it is up to the Senate to, in the first instance, say and then negotiate what that means when it comes to approving a president's nominees. I mean, historically, advice and consent has meant deferring to the president's prerogatives. But even when you look at some of the writing that was done in the Federalist Papers, the founders viewed the advice and consent responsibility as something that would rein in potential abuses and ensure that a president was appointing and nominating qualified people because they would have to receive the advice and consent of the Senate.
And looking, based on what you just said, it feels like most of the investigative responsibility is somehow entirely remains in the executive branch. We have three branches of government, and there really isn't much accountability at this point for the judicial branch. And it feels like, based on what you said, it seems like the Senate and the presidency being held by the same party is going to pretty much guarantee a result. What do you kind of see as the future of, if there was a split between Senate and presidency of different parties, do you think that we're ever going to see a kind of return to normalcy where there will be legitimate vetting and, reform to this process such that we could see a president of one party, a Senate of a different party, majority of a different party, and a, reasonable passage for both Supreme Court justices and lower court nominees?
Well, look, I think that in a lot of ways we've returned to the norm where there is responsible vetting that is now happening of nominees, and you see that in terms of the lack of the kinds of conflicts of interest issues and the lack of personal issues that are coming up when President Biden is nominating candidates. I mean, if people remember in the early days of the Trump administration, I mean, he was nominating folks that were dealing with unprecedented vetting issues, right? Folks who had not paid their taxes, folks who had hired undocumented workers to work for them. And looking back, remember, it was the Zoe Baird nanny tax issue that gave rise to the focus on vetting candidates, or at least vetting candidates to the degree that they're vetted now in the modern day. Can you give
our listeners a little background on that one?
Yeah, I mean, so this was President Clinton's nominee to be Attorney General, but it turned out that they had a domestic employee that she wasn't paying all the appropriate taxes on as a domestic employee. Basically, she wasn't being treated like an employee. From then on, every presidential nominee, I suspect, I didn't work in the Clinton administration, but I suspect in the Clinton administration and definitely in the Obama administration, one of the many questions we would ask was about whether or not they were appropriately paying taxes on any domestic help. What we saw, though, during the Trump administration is that all of these issues that ordinarily would be immediately disqualifying for Republicans in any other administration, they were willing to turn a blind eye to when it came to even some of the senior-most appointments in the Trump administration, folks who had apparent and real conflicts of interests, folks who were not divesting from assets that created conflicts of interest continue to serve in positions. And that is just not what we are seeing now. So that doesn't mean that the problem is solved. The argument that I made was that right now we have a system that depends on a president and a White House who wants to ensure that they have nominees that meet certain, ethical, legal, and financial standards that ensure that they are qualified, trustworthy, will act in the best interest of the American people. And there are things that the Senate can do so that we don't need to rely on the president to share those values.
So speaking specifically on, let's make this more of a concrete example. So did your views on judicial accountability change at all in light of Judge Eileen Cannon's decision regarding the special master and rulings in USA v. Trump around the discovery of classified documents at his Mar-a-Lago home?
So, look, Judge Cannon's decisions ended up being overruled by, I think it was a 3-judge panel that included 2 judges that President Trump appointed, which is interesting and, should provide people some confidence in how the judiciary can function. And I don't know Judge Cannon's background, but from my understanding, her assessment of the law and her rulings in that case were very, I guess the most diplomatic way to put it, maybe is irregular and did not seem to be consistent with precedent. So, there are other judicial appointments that were made during the Trump administration that I more closely followed that seemed to me to indicate there was not as much rigor in assessing folks' qualifications to serve on the bench, and that the amount of, whether it was experience litigating cases, experience in the law, generally, folks' judicial temperament. I mean, people who were deemed by the bar to be unqualified to sit as judges were nonetheless nominated and confirmed to appointments. That does not give me a whole lot of confidence in that process. I mean, thankfully, I think that President Biden has done an excellent job, both in filling vacancies, but also filling them with a diverse cohort of jurists, folks that are a bit outside of the mold of the traditional folks that you would normally look to serve on the bench, meaning that lawyers who have worked for civil rights organizations, lawyers that have worked for legal aid organizations and clinics are being nominated. The diversity of the judges who are being nominated to positions gives me hope and confidence that you have a set of jurists who represent the diversity of the legal field more broadly and the interests of the American people more broadly. That said, there are a whole slew of ways that I think that we could reform the judiciary, and I think you're getting more elected officials who are willing to really take a serious look at how we do that, whether it's by, making sure that the Supreme Court has a code of conduct, that they're meeting ethical guidelines, and making sure that we have a sufficient number of lower courts, and then beginning to explore really whether the way that Supreme Court justices are nominated and confirmed and their lifetime appointments, whether that all makes sense, are things that folks are looking at. And, President Biden himself, one of the things that he did right when he went into the White House was put together a commission to look at those kinds of reforms to see what might be most effective and then also what might be most likely to garner bipartisan support in the future.
Well, thank you very much. And just to switch gears a little bit, because we've kind of talked about the documents issue and it is in the news right now and your experience on the Obama transition team. Can you talk about they've now found documents at former President Trump's home, former Vice President Pence, and current President Biden's home. Can you talk about, we don't want to say that all of these cases are equivalent, but is there a larger takeaway about both the transition processes and the classification process?
Yeah. So my hope is by this point, given the exhaustive amount of media coverage, that folks understand the obvious ways that the Mar-a-Lago case is substantially different than the Biden case. But to spare us and not go into those details, one of the opportunities that I think that these circumstances provide is to look at the way the transition process occurs, the presidential transition process. Look, the reality is there's a lot of pressure on staff when a presidential transition occurs. I think folks have to remember that the jobs in the White House, every job is almost impossible, meaning that the demands on the people who are occupying those roles are so great that there is no way that to do everything well that you need to do by the end of each day. And on top of the day jobs that they have to do when a transition process occurs, they need to prepare to, pack up all of the president's belongings and to close down shop and to move out and to make sure that from 1 minute to the next that you still have continuity in government, meaning at 12:01 p.m. on January 20th, the president and their team is ready to move out and another president's team is ready to move in. Yes, the archives comes to the White House and comes to the executive office of the president in the months leading up to the transition and provides guidance on how you're supposed to file and index documents. But that work that staff needs to do is given to them on top of their already demanding jobs. So that doesn't make it okay for mistakes to happen. But from my perspective, it makes me understand the context in which those mistakes happen. So there are things that Congress could do to, for example, provide more resources to the executive branch so that the transition happens in a more orderly way and that perhaps there's more resources provided for archiving documents when transitions do occur. The other opportunity that I feel like we have is to have a rational conversation about the amount of information that is considered classified within the federal government. So this is something that came up in the 9/11 report. It is something that both parties have talked about from time to time in Congress. But there really are incentives for executive branch personnel, especially those with classification authority, to err on the side of classifying documents rather than not. And what that means is that you're going to have more classified information. The Brennan Center, as you know, where I previously worked, has issued some very informative reports on this topic. And I think there's some real reforms that could be made to address this problem. And my hope is that there are some responsible members in Congress who, instead of trying to take advantage of the political opportunity that results from this, will actually address these issues. Now, none of that is to forgive or excuse what we have seen in former President Trump's case, right? Where he and his team were not forthright about the documents that were taken from the White House, where there is evidence that he had full knowledge of the documents that were taken, and that they first refused to answer the Justice Department's and the FBI's questions, and then there's evidence that they misrepresented the facts when they did answer those questions. So that is why there is possible criminal culpability and conduct in one case, but not in the others, at least based on the information that is publicly known right now.
Well, thank you very much for your insights on that. I mean, it's definitely, I remember also in the 9/11 report, they also talked about the transition process itself as one of the things that may have led to things getting missed. Moving towards Congress, so you talked about people who have impossible jobs and have too many things to do. And the bills and the reforms you're talking about seem pretty complicated. most congressmen will have 2 to 4 policy staffers. How do you view a way to make it so those 2 to 4 staffers, or maybe they need more staff? What can we do to make it so Congress can take on the nuanced and, increasingly complicated issues of our day?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a hugely important topic. I have to say that one of the bright spots in Congress from the past few years has been the work that the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress has done, a bipartisan committee that has come together and worked to develop proposals, many of which actually have been adopted in the last Congress, some of which still need to be adopted, that focus on better resourcing and staffing Congress, proposals to reestablish the Office of Science and Technology Policy, for example, within Congress, to better develop expertise in specific areas. Because I think you're right there, and this was made most obvious, I think, during some of the hearings of the large tech companies that took place in the past couple of years. Just the lack of knowledge and depth of knowledge and how technology and social media companies in particular operate was on full display during some of those oversight hearings. Congress people need to be better resourced. And I think that there needs to be more incentives provided to congressional staff. And I think that former Speaker Nancy Pelosi deserves all the credit in the world for the first time in a long time, increasing, for example, the staff salaries, trying to provide more resources and training to staff on the Hill. And that work needs to continue.
Conveniently, at least for me, we can now move on to the, civil servants and that part of the discussion, because we get to pick on one of my favorite issues, which is in the 117th Congress, it was H.R. 302, Preventing a Patronage System Act of 2021, and this was the anti-Schedule F. Could you kind of describe the previous administration's proposed Schedule F plan, how important the congressional remedy would be, and the impact on rulemaking employees overall? Yeah,
sure. So Schedule F, why don't I just give a quick 30-second primer on that. So, at the end of the Trump administration, towards the end of the Trump administration, there was an executive order that President Trump signed that would have created a new class or schedule of civil servants that would essentially be exempt from the due process requirements that when it comes to disciplining or removing federal employees. And they would also the positions would be exempt from the merit rules that typically apply to hiring civil servants. So earlier in the podcast, we were talking about how, there's over 2 million federal government employees. Most of them are considered civil servants, which means that they have to be hired based on merit. And when they are disciplined for a poor performance, there needs to be some due process available to them to evaluate whether the discipline was appropriate and justified. So the way the executive order was written, it was actually written in a fairly vague way. So it's not entirely clear which positions would fall into this new class. There is reference to those who have, I don't have the executive order in front of me, but policy-making roles essentially could fall into this category. And it was up to the agency head to, in the first instance, say who would fall into that role. And then OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, who you referenced earlier, would have to certify that designation. So essentially, the clock expired on the Trump team, and they weren't able to implement this. The closest they got from public reports was that the Office of Management and Budget, which is a hugely significant office in the executive branch that helps implement government policy and regulations, and help provide guidance on management and budgeting to all of the other agencies. They went through an assessment and found that something like 85% of their employees, of their 315 or 350 so employees, would fall into this category, which means that potentially you had a huge portion of one of the most important federal agencies would be susceptible to removal at will by a president, which means you could have this, whiplash and loss of an incredible amount of agency institutional knowledge when you move from one administration to the next. And even outside of OMB, like the kinds of positions that would fall into this category are pretty concerning. I mean, if you think about, the people who say responsible for developing how the country is going to respond to the next pandemic, or who are responsible for developing policies that pertain to how you sanction other countries, or who develop foreign policies. I mean, a whole slew of very important work, how maybe the census, the next census is done. Like those might all be susceptible to this executive order. So it is hugely disturbing, both because of the consequences it could have for policy if people are actually removed, but it also, frankly, could impact the way the existing professionals, even if they're not removed, do their jobs, right? Because if they think that the advice and guidance that they're going to be giving political appointees or the White House could lead to retribution or their removal, then they might censor themselves and censor the advice that they're giving to political appointees, which itself is harmful. I mean, I have to tell you, as someone who worked in the government, one of the hardest things to do is to tell either the head of an agency or the president themselves no when they can't do something because either it doesn't satisfy a policy that they themselves had put forward or implemented, or it could lead to legal risk. So anyway, those are some of the few problems with it. And the legislation that you reference was a response to that executive order. So President Biden, in the early days of his administration, rescinded President Trump's executive order. And then there was a group of legislators led by, I believe, Representative Connolly in the House and Senator Kaine in the Senate, who tried to advance legislation that would require congressional approval before, in the future, there was the creation of a new schedule of employees. The idea is to create a guardrail or hurdles so that in the future, if there's another administration or president who wants to implement this, that they would have to get congressional approval in advance. Unfortunately, the bill did not make it through Congress. It was passed through the House. There was some effort to have it become a part of the National Defense Authorization Act during the lame duck. That was unsuccessful, unfortunately. But there is still a substantial need to respond. This is a huge vulnerability that I think folks are not paying enough attention to. And now, from what has been publicly reported, it is becoming part of the mainstream platform of the Republican Party. So other candidates for president are referring to this executive order, or they're not formally candidates for president yet, but they are reported to be considering runs for president, have talked positively about this executive order and the need to rein in civil servants. I mean, this is all part of this fear-mongering that it was developed during the Trump administration about a quote-unquote deep state that was out to get him, which I think is completely baseless and dangerous rhetoric.
Also, as you said, it passed through the House with bipartisan support in the 117th Congress, had support in the Senate. What can our listeners do? Can we just call our congressman, or is there anything else we can do to try to get this passed?
Look, I think that the more that we are talking about what the consequences would be about Schedule F, the better. And I think, interestingly, these issues that folks have put into the category of like good government have historically, there has not been a lot of interest in putting one's political capital in advancing those kinds of issues, right? Voters generally have not rewarded presidents and other candidates when they've tried to advance these good government measures. And I think that in a fundamental level, what the American people, I think, would value is, as we started this podcast, is a government that can deliver for them and operates effectively and efficiently. And responding to this threat gets to all of those issues, right? You're not going to have a government that adopts good policy that is lawfully implemented if you don't have expertise within agencies in order to develop and advance that policy. I mean, even if a president decides to remove all of the folks from the Office of Management and Budget and put their cronies into certain positions, get a regulation through, that's only going to make it more vulnerable when it comes to judicial review, right? If it doesn't go through the rulemaking process and there's not public comment done appropriately, and if it doesn't satisfy the Administrative Procedure Act, then it's likely to be struck down. So it does a disservice to advancing responsible and good policy. So I think that people need to talk about it in those terms. And we need to get back to a place where we talk about public service and government service as being an honorable profession, as something that we value and are grateful to the people who serve in these roles. Because, look, these are the same people who, research cures for deadly disease. They keep our water and air clean, right? They manage the safety of our nuclear arsenal. These are incredibly important jobs that folks need to think about in that context.
Well, hopefully we can end on a little bit of a brighter note than the doom and gloom of hollowing out the expertise of the federal government. But if you could pass one bill, rule, constitutional amendment to make the U.S. government work better, what would it be? It's your magic wand.
No, this is actually an interview question that we ask folks who are coming to Democracy Fund.
Oh, good. Now I get the answer for when this
there
makes
we
sense.
go.
Works out perfectly for me.
At least this is the interview question that my team asks. Well, look, there's no silver bullet, right? And so I think knowing that there is no silver bullet, it sort of depends on the day, what I would say in response to this question.
Well, how are you feeling today?
Today, I feel like we should talk either about Citizens United, so maybe a constitutional amendment responding to dark money and money in politics, or reforming the Electoral College. I think that, the principle of one person, one vote, and the winner of the national popular vote actually winning the presidency is probably the right way to go. It would at least set the bar for how we conduct elections and think about our democracy and, down the line.
So what are you reading these days?
Oh, there's so many good books I have sitting on my shelf, and they just pile up, and I never have time to get to them. But one good book that was referred to me that I started reading is called The Age of Acrimony. So it is about the America's democracy after the Civil War into the early 20th century, and how we adopted a slew of reforms that sort of mollified the extremes that were taking place, the extremes that were growing in our politics. And so it was referred to me because folks thought, and I think that this is true thus far, I'm about 100 pages in, about the similarities between then and now in terms of what we are seeing in our politics and the divisiveness and some of the risks and dangers. And then Chocolate City is a book about the history of our capital, Washington, D.C. And, that is a book I started reading when there was increased movement and talk about representation for the district. It still is shocking to me that there are that many people who are not represented in Congress.
I think their license plate says that, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Taxation without representation. It's the best license plate I feel like I've had. And then I recently bought, but have not started reading, Eric Larson's new book, The Splendid and the Vile. The author of The Devil in the White City. We are in Chicago after all, so I feel like that one's worth mentioning.
The World's Fair was actually partially staged on the Chicago campus, so we appreciate you, making sure something relevant to where you're being interviewed.
That's right. No, it's a great book, which is why I wanted to get his most recent one.
Well, thank you very much. And then favorite app that you have on your phone right now?
Favorite app? That's a good question. I feel like the Headspace app is one that is pretty good. It has forced me to just pause more than anything throughout the day to try to put the work that I'm doing, which can be very heavy at times, into context. And I feel like that's generally a healthy thing to do.
And then what's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Boy, these are tough questions.
I thought the earlier ones were going to be the more difficult ones, but I guess we really dug into the hard ones at the end.
Well, I'm fortunate that I feel like I've received so much advice over the years. I remember when I was going to DC from Chicago for my first job, somebody told me never underestimate where you could end up. And I could never have predicted the crazy professional ride that I experienced in the 7.5 years I was in DC that took me from being, an unpaid associate in the White House to being an assistant to President Obama and running the presidential personnel office. So that advice is probably some of the best advice I was ever given.
Well, thank you very much for your time. And I'd also like to thank the Center for Effective Government at the University of Chicago and Dion Lamel. And we look forward to hearing more from you, Rudy, in the future. And thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Forum. We hope you enjoyed this discussion about effective government and accountability. We would like to thank Rudy Mehrbani, Dion Lamel, and the Center for Effective Government for their help with this episode. The Forum is a project of UC3P, the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy Podcast Network. The Forum is produced by Cole Von Glahn and Ibrahim Rashid. This episode was edited by Eric Geber. If you'd like to learn more or connect with us, please view the relevant details in our show notes. Until we see you again, I hope you continue being curious out loud.